discuss a little bit about CSS rule sets and what are different ways in which you can select HTML elements inside of your HTML document. So we'll continue with the discussion we had in the previous video. We have an H1 present in the HTML document, and I will try to go ahead and change the stylings for it, but I will be using different CSS selector types to kind of select the HTML element. So inside of my style.css, the very basic selector is the HTML tag. So before all of that, let's first of all discuss the structure of a CSS rule set. So the first thing that comes in a CSS rule set is what we call a CSS selector. This CSS selector is basically the identifier which kind of identifies which HTML element to pick to apply all of these different styles to. So this could be either an HTML tag, it could be classes, it could be IDs, it could be data attributes, or it could be a combination of all of these, which we'll learn about in the next video when we discuss CSS combinators. But ideally, these 4-5 ways of selecting HTML elements is what is defined in the CSS specification as well. So the very basic way of selecting any HTML element is using the tag name, that is H1. And once I go back to my page, I can see that the styling of color red has already been applied. I can go ahead and add more styling definitions to it, which we already did in the previous video. I can say that the font size is maybe 50 pixels, and I want the background color to be black. And as you can see, I can keep on adding multiple style definitions to the same element. Now, this is a way of selecting H1 element, but this will work for all of the H1 elements present in the page. So let's say there is another H1 which you have added, and it says hello web developer. So now both the H1s will be targeted because H1, it's a way of understanding of CSS that when I'm saying that target the H1, CSS is going to target all the H1s present in the page. Now, if you want a kind of specificity that you only want to target a particular H1 and not all of the H1s, you can start passing different HTML attributes like classes, IDs, and data attributes to make it much more specific. So let's say my hello CSS learners is the main H1 tag, and the rest of the H1 tags is not that important. I don't want to apply any other styles to it. So for my H1, I'll go ahead and add a class of, let's say, main heading, right? And inside of my CSS, because now I want to target this H1, I will not just say H1, rather I will say main heading. And you can see what the difference of the selector is all about. So whenever you are selecting or whenever you are defining a class in the CSS, a class which has already been defined in the HTML, you want to select that class, you use a dot operator followed by the class name. So the class name here is main heading. So in order to select this H1 element with a class of main heading, we use a dot operator and then the name of the class. And here I will say that the color needs to be, let's say, blue, and the font size needs to be, let's say, 70 pixels. Now I hit on save, go back to my page, and now you can see that even though the H1 styles have been defined, yet I have defined a much more specific style using the class attribute, and this class attribute is taking preference over this H1 stylings that I have applied. Now, even though if I do this and I go back, nothing will change, even though we saw in the previous video that H1, because it was coming later on, it kind of took preference. Yet here we are talking about CSS specificity. That simply means that HTML tags have a lower preference than class names. Now, moving on, let's say that I want to club both of these H1 together to have a similar style, but there are more H1 tags. Let's say there are two, or rather, let's not create multiple H1 tags. Let us create a bit of some paragraphs. So I will say there are 4 paragraphs, right? and each of them have some text in it. So let's say I auto-generated some text inside of here, and let me just generate more text here and the text here. Now I go back and let me clear out the CSS file as well. I go back. I can see that there are 4 paragraphs. Now let us say I want to give the first and the third paragraph some same stylings, and I want to give the second and the fourth paragraph some different stylings. Now, ideally, what you can do is you can create a class for each of these paragraphs and then use each of these 4 individual classes inside of your CSS to apply the style for it. But I'll play it smart and I will give common class names to the paragraphs which I want the same styles for, and that way I will be writing much more less CSS. So let's say for the first paragraph I will give it a class of red, and the second I want to give it a class of blue. So I want the first and the third paragraph to have similar styles. So for the third, I will give it the same class name of red. And for the fourth, I will give it a same class name of blue. So this blue needs to be inside a pair of quotes. So the second and the fourth have the same class name. The first and the third have the same class name. Now inside of my CSS, I will go ahead and define stylings for all of the HTML elements having a class name of red. So CSS will scan through the HTML documents, try to find out all of the HTML elements which have a class of red, and go ahead and apply all of the different styles that I have defined in the rule set. So I will say that the color is going to be red, and the font size, I want it to be, let's say 30 pixels. Now when I go back, now you can see that the first and the third paragraph, because of a common class name, have been applied the same CSS styles. Similarly, I can go ahead and write a blue CSS class, and I can see that the color is blue with a font size of 20 pixels. And now you can see that the second and the fourth paragraph have similar styles. Now the advantage for this is that I can make one change in the red paragraph. Let's say I want to give this or I want to change the font size to 80 pixels. Once I do this, it will work for both of the paragraphs rather than just one of the paragraphs. So this is the concept of a class. This is why classes are used in CSS to group multiple HTML elements together to give them the same stylings. I will revert it back to the original size of 30 pixels. Now, let us go back to the HTML and try to understand how we can use IDs for CSS selecting. Now, let's say the fourth paragraph is an exclusive paragraph and I want a different style for it altogether. And I don't want that style to resemble any of the styles the third, the second, and the first paragraphs have. So for the fourth paragraph, I can define an ID here as well, and I can say special para. Now this ID can be anything which you want. And inside of my CSS, I will select the paragraph with the ID of special para using the hash notation, which is special para, special para. And then inside of my special para, I will say that the color needs to be yellow, and the font weight is used to define the thickness. The font weight should be 800. Now, okay, so yellow is not that visible, so let's make it orange red. And now you can see that even though the blue class was added in the paragraph, yet because of the ID and because of the cascading effect and CSS specificity, that IDs have a much more greater preference over classes, and classes have a much more greater preference over normal HTML tag names. Because I defined a CSS rule set using the ID, this one is going to take preference, and the styles defined as part of the ID rule set is going to get applied to my paragraph. This is the concept of using IDs to style a particular HTML element which is very specific to the entire page, and you know there is not going to be any other HTML element with the same ID. So IDs are kind of unique identifiers. It does not mean that you need to give each and every HTML element in your page a unique identifier. Ideally, try to give a ID to only those HTML elements which require a very specific type of styles exclusive to the entire page. And now finally, let's try to understand how we can use data attributes to kind of style the HTML elements. So let's go ahead and pass in a data attribute to the first paragraph, and I will say data hyphen and then the name of the attribute. Let's say I give this data hyphen main, and its value is going to be main heading. Now I want to select this paragraph. I want to select this paragraph which has a data attribute of data main, which has a value of main heading. So this kind of works like a class, that because all of the HTML elements which are going to have the similar custom property and the similar custom value, which is main heading, all of those elements will be selected by default. But because I'm trying to define here the use case of, sorry about that, the use case of any data attribute, so inside of my CSS I will go ahead and I will select the data attribute inside of my CSS, and to do that you use a pair of square brackets, and inside of the pair of square brackets you define the attribute as well as the value. So you will say data hyphen main, and its value should be equal to main heading, which is what I gave here, main hyphen heading. So I have selected the element or elements having the custom attribute of data main, and then I can go ahead and say that the color needs to be caret blue, and the font size could be, let's say, 45 pixels with a font weight of 600. Now let's go back, and now you can see even though that the classes, even though the classes CSS was given for the class of red, yet the data attribute took preference, and that is solely because this is coming right after the class. If I moved this to the very top and I hit on save, so you can see that the first class, which was red, the styles defined inside of the red class are still getting applied. That is because